The wind howled, rattling the windows so hard I wondered if they'd shatter. I gripped the baseball bat tighter, feeling the rough wood pressing into my palms. The front door hung open, swinging slowly back and forth with every gust, and the cold air flooded in, carrying the damp, electric scent of an approaching storm. I'd only cracked open a window earlier to catch some air, and now this. The living room felt eerily silent behind me. It was the kind of silence that shouldn't exist in a house that used to be full of life, with laughter echoing off the walls. But tonight, there was nothing. Just me, Jackson, and that overwhelming sense of dread. A golden retriever, Jackson, stood by my side, every muscle in his old body taut, ears perked up. He wasn't barking, just letting out a low, warning growl. The kind that made your skin prickle, because dogs know things. They sense the things you'd rather not face. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. It was 12:34 a.m., and Rebecca still wasn't home from that damn charity meeting. Except, deep down, I knew this wasn't just a late night. It wasn't just another excuse. We'd passed that point weeks ago, when everything normal about our lives had slowly twisted into something unfamiliar and dark. The door creaked again, and I moved forward, the bat raised. Each step felt like an eternity, and I couldn't help but think about how ridiculous I must have looked, an old man with a baseball bat, trying to defend a home that already felt empty. I should have been asleep hours ago, dreaming about those easy days we'd promised ourselves once the kids were grown. Instead, here I was, bracing myself for, what? An intruder? Or the truth? Then, I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of gravel outside, followed by low voices. My grip on the bat tightened as I stepped closer to the doorframe, peering out into the night. The porch light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the yard. And there she was. Rebecca. My wife. The woman I'd spent almost 40 years building a life with. She stood at the edge of the driveway, illuminated by the wavering light, and she wasn't alone. A man stood with her, half hidden in the dark. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I didn't need to. The way she leaned toward him, the way they whispered to each other like they shared a secret. It was all I needed to see. My knees nearly buckled. The shock, the anger, the gut-wrenching betrayal, it all hit me at once, like a punch to the chest. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. Just stood there, watching my world come undone in slow motion. Rebecca's laughter, low, familiar, and heartbreakingly intimate, floated through the air. It was the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in months. The kind that used to be reserved for me, for us. Jackson let out another growl, and it snapped me back to reality. I wanted to burst out there, to demand answers, to yell and make them both face what they were doing to me. To us. But I couldn't. My feet felt like they were stuck to the floor, held down by years of trust and love and shared memories that now felt like lies. Rebecca turned, and for a second, her eyes met mine through the crack in the door. Her smile faltered, and the light in her eyes flickered out. She knew. She knew I'd seen everything. The man beside her took a step back, disappearing into the shadows, and Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth. The silence that followed was louder than any words. Paul, she whispered, like my name was a question she didn't know how to answer. But there was no answer that could fix this. No explanation that could take away the sight of her standing there with him, sharing pieces of herself that I'd thought were mine. The storm broke, rain pounding against the roof, and I knew in that moment, this was the beginning of something I could never undo. Rebecca's eyes locked onto mine through the crack in the door, wide and desperate. Rain streamed down her face, soaking her hair and making her look almost ghostly. She didn't seem to care that she was drenched. The man, Tom, shifted awkwardly beside her, like he couldn't decide whether to run or stay. The wind whipped around us, and I could barely hear over the storm. But inside, something far more powerful was building, like a dam about to burst. I clenched the baseball bat tighter, my pulse racing. Paul, Rebecca said, her voice cracking. She stepped toward me, her hands raised in some kind of shaky surrender. But my eyes weren't on her anymore. They were on him, the man who'd crossed into my life, into what I thought was safe. "Who are you?" I spat, my voice raw, straining to be heard over the wind. The bat felt heavy, but I was ready to use it if I had to. "Get away from my wife." Tom's eyes widened, and he lifted his hands, palms out, like he was trying to calm me down. But the look on his face, like he wasn't taking me seriously, only made my blood boil. Before I even knew what I was doing, I let the bat slip from my fingers and charged at him. We hit the wet ground hard, a mess of fists and mud. My knuckles connected with his jaw, and I barely registered the pain in my own hands. He grunted, shoving at me, but I was too far gone to care. The weeks of suspicion, the endless nights wondering, all of it came crashing out in a wave of anger. "Paul, stop!" Rebecca's voice cut through the chaos, but I barely heard her. Tom tried to push me off, gasping, his face twisted in shock and fear. "It's not," he choked out, struggling, "what you think." I pulled back just enough to look at him, my breath coming in short, harsh bursts. "Then what the hell is it?" I shouted, rain pouring down my face. "Explain it to me." He didn't. He couldn't. His silence was enough. It hit me harder than any punch ever could. I staggered back, chest heaving, feeling the fight drain out of me. The truth was written all over his face, in Rebecca's tears, in the way the world felt like it was splitting apart. Rebecca grabbed my arm, her fingers cold and shaking. "Paul," she sobbed, her voice raw, "please. This isn't worth it. Please, just come inside." I looked at her, the woman I'd loved for most of my life, and felt something inside me break. The rain kept coming, relentless, and I wondered if anything would ever feel whole again. Tom didn't wait around for a second chance. As soon as I released him, he scrambled to his feet, slipping and sliding on the wet grass. His hands were shaking as he desperately fumbled for his keys, and I watched as he bolted toward his shiny black car parked at the curb, a luxury sedan that screamed privilege and arrogance. He threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door, his face pale with fear. I didn't chase him. I just stood there, rain soaking me to the bone, watching as his tires spun in the mud before he sped off into the storm, tail lights vanishing into the darkness. Part of me wanted to laugh at how pathetic he looked, running away like a coward, but there was nothing funny about any of this. Rebecca stood in the rain, crying, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked up at me, her eyes red and desperate. For a brief moment, I saw the woman I'd loved for nearly 40 years. But that illusion shattered when I remembered where we were and what had just happened. "Inside." "Now," I said, my voice cold and hard. I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open for her. The sound of her footsteps squelching in the mud followed a moment later, and she dripped water all over the floor as she stepped inside. Once we were both in the hallway, I grabbed a towel from the closet and tossed it to her. She caught it but didn't bother to dry herself off. Instead, she just stood there, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline, looking like she wanted to say something. I didn't give her the chance. "We're done, Rebecca," I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "I'm not doing this anymore. We're getting a divorce." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then she started shaking her head, water droplets flying everywhere. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "No, Paul. Please. We can fix this. We can." "No," I cut her off, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "This isn't something you fix. You broke us. You made your choice." The anger I'd felt outside was gone, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. "I'll hire a lawyer. I'll do whatever it takes, but I'm done. You're not dragging me through this anymore." Tears streamed down her face, but I felt nothing. Just empty. "You can't do this," she whispered. "Paul, please. We've been together for almost 40 years. You can't just throw that away." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "I'm not the one who threw it away," I said, my voice cracking. "You did, Rebecca. You made that choice when you decided I wasn't enough for you." She crumpled, her sobs muffled as she covered her face with her hands. But I couldn't look at her anymore. "Go sleep in the guest room," I said, turning my back to her. "I don't want to see you. Not tonight." "Paul," her voice cracked, and she sounded so small, so broken, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. "Just go," I repeated, my back still to her. "Go." I heard her footsteps retreating down the hallway, growing fainter until I heard a door close somewhere in the distance. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. I stood there, drenched, feeling the weight of everything settle in. Jackson, a golden retriever, came up to me, his tail wagging hesitantly. I knelt down and buried my face in his warm fur, finding the only comfort I had left in the world. The days after I demanded a divorce felt like a blur, filled with anger and a hollow numbness that never quite left. I couldn't stand to have Rebecca in the house, her very presence like a constant stab in my chest. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I locked her in the old shed out back. Yeah, the one where we kept rusted tools and forgotten cans of paint. I threw in a ratty blanket and left her a bottle of water and scraps of food. She screamed, begged, swore at me, but I ignored it. I had to. 40 years, I muttered one evening, standing outside the shed. The wind rustled through the trees, whispering like ghosts. 40 years of lies. My voice cracked, but there was no one there to hear. Sometimes I tossed her food, the way you'd throw scraps to a stray dog. Once, she stared at me like I'd lost my mind before grabbing the sandwich and retreating into the shadows. Every time she tried to yell or insist I was wrong, I'd just slam the door shut. But then came the night when everything fell apart even more. I woke up to a noise in the house, something faint but out of place. Groggy, I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept downstairs. The living room was dark, shadows stretching across the walls. And there, crouched by my desk, was Rebecca. Somehow, she'd managed to slip out of the shed, and now she was digging through my papers, scattering bank statements and documents all over the floor. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, my voice rough and cutting. She jumped, spinning around, clutching a handful of papers. Her eyes were wild, her hair a tangled mess. "It's none of your damn business," she spat back, clutching the documents tighter. My blood boiled. Before I knew what I was doing, I crossed the room and grabbed her by the hair. She screamed, kicking, but I yanked her out of the house, the cold night air slapping us both as we stumbled through the yard. "You think you can steal from me?" I shouted, dragging her toward the shed. "After everything you've done?" Rain poured down, soaking us to the bone. She fought me, clawing at my hands, but I was too angry to care. I shoved her inside, my chest heaving. "You not running away again," I snarled. I grabbed the heavy chain from the corner, the one we'd used years ago to tie up our old guard dog. Before she could even react, I wrapped it around her ankle and locked it to the metal hook bolted into the wall. "Paul, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "You can't do this. I'm your wife." I stepped back, breathing hard. She wasn't my wife anymore. Not the woman I'd known. "Not after what you did," I said, my voice hollow. I slammed the shed door shut and locked it, the sound of the bolt sliding into place echoing louder than the storm. The storm had finally passed, but the silence it left behind was more unsettling than the howling wind had ever been. The house felt empty, even though Rebecca was still there, chained up in the shed out back. The reality of what I'd done, of the man I'd become, gnawed at me, but the anger and betrayal still burned, fighting off the guilt. I sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee clutched in my hands, staring at the blank wall in front of me. The memories wouldn't stop. They played in an endless loop, every laugh, every smile, every moment I'd once cherished now twisted into something bitter. I kept hearing Rebecca's voice, pleading and breaking, telling me that I didn't know the whole story. But how could I believe her now? Jackson, my golden retriever, lay at my feet, his eyes watchful and concerned. Even he sensed that something was wrong, that the life we'd known was gone. My phone buzzed again. A second message from Michael, my oldest son. Dad, please. What's going on? Mom sounded different. Are you okay? I hadn't answered his first text. I hadn't known what to say. But now, his worry seeped through the screen, and I felt a pang of something close to shame. Michael didn't know. None of the kids did. How could I tell them that the woman they saw as their loving mother had betrayed everything we'd built? I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. I had to think. I had to get my head straight. But before I could form a coherent thought, the back door creaked open, and the sound of shuffling footsteps snapped me out of my daze. Rebecca stood there, her hair wild and eyes swollen from crying. She looked worse than I'd ever seen her, like a ghost of the woman she used to be. But there was something defiant in her expression, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice raw but steady. I tensed, my grip tightening around the coffee mug. You broke out of the shed, I said flatly. The chain must have come loose or snapped. I should have expected it. She'd always found a way to break free when she wanted to. Her eyes flashed with something between fear and determination. Paul, this has gone too far, she said. You don't understand what's really happening. You think you know, but you don't. I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. Don't try to twist this, I snapped. I know what I saw. I know what you did. She took a step forward, and for the first time, I noticed she was holding something in her hands. Papers. The very same documents she'd been digging through the night I found her. My stomach tightened. What is that? I demanded, my voice low. She held the papers out, her hands trembling. The truth, she said. Or at least, part of it. You never asked why, Paul. You never asked why things fell apart. You just assumed. The words hit me like a physical blow. The rage and pain warred inside me, but there was something else now. Something I didn't want to feel, a doubt. I stared at her, at the woman I'd loved for nearly 40 years, and wondered if I could handle whatever truth she was about to reveal. Rebecca's voice cracked as she tried to plead her case, her eyes wide and desperate. Paul, please, she said, her voice trembling. I know I hurt you. I know I made mistakes, but don't you remember how happy we were? We built a life together, a beautiful one. Think about our children, our grandchildren. Don't throw it all away. Her words cut deep, stirring memories I'd been trying to bury. The holidays we'd spent laughing, the lazy Sundays in our old house, the nights we'd held each other close, dreaming about the future. But no amount of memories could erase the pain, the betrayal that had shattered our lives. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my jaw clenched so hard it hurt. For a moment, I almost wanted to believe her. I almost wanted to forgive, to go back to the life we'd built. But then I remembered the look in her eyes when I caught her with him, and the anger burned bright again. I loved you, I said quietly, my voice raw. God, I still love you, and maybe that's the worst part. But I can't forgive what you did. You destroyed us, Rebecca. And there's no going back. Tears streamed down her face, and she reached out, but I stepped away. Go back to the guest room, I said, my voice cold and final. Stay there until the lawyer finalizes everything. We're done. Her sobs echoed in the empty house as she retreated, and I turned away, feeling both empty and enraged. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I pulled out my phone and hesitated for only a second before dialing a number I hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Paul?" It was Vince, an old friend from a past life, back when I'd run with a rougher crowd. We'd both gone straight, more or less, but Vince had always kept one foot in the shadows. Long time, no talk. "What's up?" "I need a favor," I said, my voice steady. "A big one. And it's not exactly legal." There was a pause, and then a low chuckle. "Well, you've got my attention." "What are we talking about?" I swallowed, the weight of what I was about to do pressing on me. "A guy named Tom. He ruined my life. I want him to pay. Completely. I need your help to take everything from him." Vince's interest was piqued. "Everything, huh? You want to make him bleed, or just lose everything he's got?" "Both," I said, my hands shaking. "I want him stripped of everything. His house, his money, his dignity. And I want him left somewhere far away with nothing. Can you make that happen?" There was a beat of silence before Vince replied. "Consider it done. I'll bring some guys I trust. Give me the details." 2 days later, everything was set. Vince and his men were ready. We knew where Tom lived, his big, luxurious house that reeked of privilege and smugness. Under cover of night, we approached. The men moved like shadows, silent and efficient. They grabbed Tom before he knew what was happening, dragging him out of his home and shoving him into the back of a black SUV. I watched from the passenger seat, my heart pounding as we drove out of the city and into the woods, a place so remote that even the stars seemed to hide. Tom was shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "Paul," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Please, you don't have to do this. We can talk. We can work something out." I didn't say a word. Vince parked, and the men hauled Tom out, forcing him to his knees in the mud. One of them held a stack of legal documents, transfer papers for his house, his assets, everything he owned. "You going to sign," Vince said, his voice calm but deadly. "Every last thing over to Paul. Or we leave you here, and you'll wish we'd finished the job." Tom's hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold the pen, but he signed. Every page, every line. His face was pale, sweat mixing with the dirt on his skin. When he was done, Vince looked at me, waiting for my signal. I nodded. "Take his clothes," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Leave him with nothing." Tom's pleas turned into screams as they stripped him, leaving him shivering in his underwear. Then, without a word, we dragged him back into the SUV, drove another 1,000 miles out into the wilderness, and left him there in the darkness. I stepped out one last time, looking at the man who had ruined everything. "You took everything from me," I said. "Now it's your turn." We left him there, shivering and terrified, as the woods swallowed him whole. The door creaked open, and Michael stepped inside, his eyes darting between me and Rebecca. The tension was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. He hadn't seen us both together in months, and now here we were, on the brink of a disaster he couldn't yet comprehend. "Dad. Mom. What's going on?" he asked, his voice filled with concern and confusion. He set down his overnight bag, as if prepared to stay and sort out whatever mess he had walked into. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably on the couch, her eyes still red from crying. I could see her hope flicker, like she was silently praying that our son would be able to fix something that was long past saving. I didn't sugarcoat it. "We're getting a divorce," I said flatly, crossing my arms. "Your mother and I, things have happened that can't be undone." Michael's jaw clenched. "A divorce? After all these years?" He looked from me to Rebecca, searching for answers, but she just sat there, silent and broken. "Mom?" Tears welled up in her eyes again. "I never meant for it to get this bad," she whispered. "I made mistakes. Big ones. But we were happy ones, Michael. You know we were." Michael ran a hand through his hair, frustration written all over his face. "This is crazy," he said. Then he turned to Rebecca, his voice softening. "If you want to get away from here, come stay with me for a while. You don't have to be here if it's too hard." Rebecca's eyes widened with gratitude, but she hesitated, glancing at me. I felt my fists clench involuntarily, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't about to beg her to stay, and I sure as hell wasn't going to stop her if she wanted to leave. Michael didn't wait for her answer. He sighed heavily and turned to me. "Dad, don't let this ruin you," he said quietly. "Whatever happened, don't let it destroy everything." With that, he picked up his bag and left, leaving the house feeling colder and emptier than before. Rebecca sat there, her gaze fixed on the floor, and I knew that whatever hope we had of reconciliation had been buried for good. Later that evening, the house was eerily quiet. I sat in the living room, waiting for the divorce papers to come through, the whiskey bottle in front of me untouched. The anger simmered just beneath the surface, but exhaustion had taken over, leaving me too tired to act. Rebecca had disappeared into the guest room hours ago. Or so I thought. A loud crash jolted me awake. I ran upstairs to find the window in the guest room wide open, the curtains flapping in the cool night breeze. She was gone. My pulse spiked as I grabbed my keys and raced out the door, knowing exactly where she'd gone. I sped through the empty streets, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. There was only one place she could be. Her old friend Karen lived just a few miles away, and the two of them had been inseparable before life got in the way. It had to be her. I pulled up to Karen's house, but there was no sign of Rebecca. Frustrated, I was about to drive off when I saw her stumbling down the sidewalk, clutching an almost empty bottle of whiskey. Her hair was a mess, and her eyes were glazed, her steps unsteady. I hit the brakes, jumped out, and ran to her. "Rebecca!" I called, and she turned, a drunken smile spreading across her face. "Paul," she slurred, lifting the bottle in a mock toast. "Look who's here to rescue the damsel in distress." I didn't know whether to be angry or relieved. "Get in the car," I said, grabbing her arm to steady her. She stumbled, laughing like this was some sick joke. I shoved the passenger door open and practically pushed her inside. We drove in tense silence, the only sound the hum of the engine. Rebecca took another swig from the bottle, then let out a bitter laugh. "You want to know the truth?" she said, her voice thick with alcohol. "The real, ugly truth?" I didn't answer, but my grip on the wheel tightened. She leaned back, her eyes closing, and sighed. "I didn't just cheat on you once, Paul," she said. "Oh no, not just that one time. While you were off on your precious work trips, I had my fun. So many times. With so many men. God, it was thrilling." My vision blurred, the road in front of me turning dark. My heart pounded painfully, and my chest felt tight. I jerked the wheel, pulling over to the side of the road before I crashed. The car skidded to a stop, and I sat there, gasping for air. Rebecca kept laughing, a hollow, drunken sound. "Oh, come on," she taunted. "Don't act so surprised. You weren't around." I needed excitement. I turned to her, my hands shaking. The rage I'd felt before was nothing compared to this. I grabbed her by the hair, pulling her closer. "Why?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "Why the hell would you do that to me? To us?" She looked at me, her expression sobering just a bit, and for the first time, I saw something close to regret in her eyes. But it was too late for apologies. The damage had been done. We got back home, but any sense of peace in this house was long gone. Only emptiness, anger, and pain filled every room like poison. I was still trying to process Rebecca's shocking confession, the one she had thrown at me drunkenly in the car. Her words kept replaying in my mind like a broken record, as so many times, with so many different men. My chest burned with rage and humiliation, but I knew there was no going back. The moment we stepped inside, Rebecca seemed to lose her mind completely. She started screaming, her eyes wild, her steps unsteady. Still clutching the whiskey bottle, she suddenly hurled it across the room. It shattered on impact, glass spraying everywhere, the amber liquid spreading in a dark stain across the carpet. "You think I don't understand?" she screamed, her voice slicing through the air. She grabbed a table lamp and threw it at the wall. The lamp exploded with a deafening crash. "You always thought you were so righteous, so perfect." "Rebecca, stop," I shouted, feeling my nerves stretch to the breaking point. But she wasn't listening. She overturned a chair, then grabbed a family photo off the wall, the one of us with the kids when they were still little. She looked at it with a twisted, bitter smile before flinging it to the floor, the glass shattering into jagged pieces. "Enough!" I roared, and before I knew it, I lunged at her, grabbing her wrists. She struggled, her nails digging into my skin, but I was stronger. "You need to calm down," I yelled, dragging her down the hall, toward the basement door. "You can't lock me up," she shrieked, her voice hoarse from rage and desperation. She kicked and fought, but I managed to pull open the door and all but pushed her down the stairs. "Stay down here," I said, breathing hard. "Until you come to your senses." She fell onto the first step but kept thrashing, her eyes blazing with fury. "You're a monster," she hissed, but her voice had lost its strength. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands still shaking. The house was quiet again, but now the silence was filled with broken love, anger, and fear. I leaned against the door, closing my eyes, feeling the walls I'd built up start to crumble around me. The morning sunlight filtered through the cracks in the blinds, casting long, thin lines across the living room floor. I hadn't slept. Not really. The adrenaline from the night before still pumped through my veins, keeping me on edge. The chaos Rebecca had unleashed was like a storm that hadn't quite passed. But I knew what I had to do. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for my lawyer. It rang twice before his voice, calm and professional, came through the line. "Paul," he said. "I was just about to call you. The divorce documents will be ready by tomorrow. All you have to do is sign, and she'll be served the papers." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Thanks, Robert," I said. "I'll be ready." Hanging up, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. This was it. The beginning of the end. There was no going back. I walked to the guest room and quietly opened the door. Rebecca was still there, lying on the bed, her back to me. The fury and chaos from last night seemed to have burned out, leaving behind a woman who looked small and defeated. She was finally asleep, her breathing even and steady. I didn't want to wake her. Instead, I went to the closet and began pulling her clothes off the hangers, folding them into boxes I had stacked in the hallway. Every item I touched was a reminder of the life we'd shared, her favorite red sweater, the dress she wore to our daughter's wedding, the scarf I'd bought her on one of our anniversary trips. Each piece carried a memory, and each one felt like a knife to the heart. But I kept going, driven by a need to rid the house of her presence, to cleanse the space of the past. As I was packing away the last of her things, I heard movement behind me. I turned to find Rebecca standing in the doorway, her hair a tangled mess and her eyes red with exhaustion. She watched me in silence for a moment before speaking. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice low and defiant. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "This is my home too. You can pack my things all you want, but I'm not leaving." I stood up straight, meeting her gaze. "You will," I replied, my voice steady, though my insides felt like they were in knots. "The papers will be ready tomorrow." Once the divorce is finalized, you're out. Rebecca's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might throw another fit, destroy something else in her rage. But instead, she turned on her heel, grabbed her coat from the chair, and stormed out the front door. The screen door banged shut behind her, echoing through the empty house. I watched her leave, my heart pounding. I didn't know where she was going, and part of me didn't care. I just wanted this to be over. As soon as she was out of sight, I continued packing, making sure all of her belongings were in one place. Clothes, shoes, old photo albums, everything that reminded me of her went into the same pile. I was done holding on to the past. The morning was heavy with anticipation, a tension that seemed to thrum through every wall of the house. I stood in the living room, staring out the window at the grey sky, my hands clenched into fists. The storm from last night had left a residue of chaos, but today was the day everything would end. Today was the day I would finally take my life back. A knock at the door broke my trance. I opened it to find my lawyer, Robert, standing there with a leather briefcase in hand. His expression was calm, professional, but there was a hint of understanding in his eyes. "Paul," he greeted me. "I have everything you need." He handed me the divorce papers. The ink was still fresh, and the signatures made it all real. I felt a strange sense of finality, a mixture of relief and sadness. But mostly, I felt free. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. Robert nodded, gave me a firm handshake, and left, his footsteps echoing down the walkway. I turned back into the house, clutching the papers like a shield. This was it. The end of an era, and the beginning of whatever came next. I found Rebecca in the guest room, sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and lined with exhaustion. She looked up at me, her eyes narrowing as she saw the documents in my hand. "It's over," I said, my voice hard and unyielding. "Pack your things. Take your car and get out. I don't care where you go, just leave." She stared at me, defiance flashing in her eyes. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice low and venomous. "You can't make me." Anger surged through me, and before I knew it, I was grabbing her things and throwing them out the nearest window. Her jewelry, her clothes, suitcases full of memories I wanted to erase, all of it went flying into the yard. The sound of smashing glass and the thud of falling bags filled the air, a chaotic symphony of our ruined life. Rebecca screamed in outrage, rushing toward me, her hands curled into fists. "Stop it," she shrieked. "You're insane." But I didn't stop. I kept going, each toss feeling like a weight lifted off my chest. She finally pulled out her phone and called the police, her voice cracking with desperation as she reported what I was doing. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived, their sirens blaring. They burst through the front door, hands on their belts, ready to take me down. "Sir, put your hands where we can see them," one of them barked. I stood still, my heart racing, but I held up the divorce papers. "This is my house," I said, my voice steady but strained. "And these are the documents to prove it. We're divorced as of today. I have every right to make her leave." The officers took the papers, scanning them carefully. After a tense moment, they nodded, handing them back to me. "He's right," one of them said to Rebecca. "He has every legal right to ask you to leave." Rebecca's face crumpled, her defiance replaced by panic. She turned to me, her hand flying out to slap me hard across the face. "You bastard," she spat. "How could you do this to me?" My cheek stung, but I didn't flinch. I looked her dead in the eyes, my voice cold and final. "Get out," I said. "Leave before I decide to destroy whatever's left of you." Tears streamed down her face, but she saw that I wasn't bluffing. Defeated, she stormed out of the house, gathering her belongings as quickly as she could. She stuffed everything into her car, slamming the trunk shut with a furious finality. I stood on the porch, watching as she drove off, the sound of her engine fading into the distance. I didn't know where she was going, and I didn't care. The storm had finally passed, and she was gone. Jackson, my old golden retriever, came to sit beside me, his tail wagging gently. I knelt down, burying my hands in his fur, feeling the warmth and comfort of the only loyal soul left in my life. The house was quiet now, a silence that felt different. It wasn't empty, it was peaceful. I took a deep breath, the weight of the past slowly lifting. I had lost so much, but I had survived. And for now, that was enough.